And then in verse 3, or starting in verse 2, really, the sages of Israel began making a comparison, as the text kind of sets it up for that, between Abimelech and the Pharaoh, between the Philistines and the Egyptians. The first thing they note is that the word used to describe what the Pharaoh and what Abimelech did with regards to Sarah is the exact same word. It's lakah. They could have chosen a bunch of different words, but they chose the same word. Well, Moses probably, the Holy Spirit through Moses, chose the same word. So that creates a bond between the two. I mean, even if it wasn't for that word, still the event is almost identical. Mm-hmm. So it just draws our attention. But with the word itself, it deepens the connection between the two passages. And, you know, the Pharaoh did not receive the benefit of a dream from God or a conversation with God. Mm-hmm. He just naturally realized something was up and confronts Abraham, because there's a correlation. There might be a causation between what
his arrival and then these things happening.
Yeah. But Abimelech received a dream and actually had the opportunity to have a full-blown conversation with God about this in his dream. And of course they ask themselves, why? Why did God treat Abimelech, the Philistine, differently than Pharaoh and the Egyptians? And that's going to get answered maybe a little further down, because we didn't read all the way through verse 7 yet. So
no.
So I'm not going to go too far into that. But, you know, one thing that the Lord brought to my attention was Sarah's 90 years old now. What does a king see in a 90-year-old woman that makes him go, ooh la la, I need to marry her?
Ooh la la.
You know, and that made me think, well, they were in Egypt only 24 years ago. That means when the Pharaoh kidnapped her, she was 66 years old. What does a Pharaoh see in a 66-year-old woman? He could have married any 18-year-old, 16-year-old girl
that he wanted.
He wanted, you know, spring chicken. But he goes for them. What's the reason? And you know, Ramban says that, another commentator says that in order for her to be able to give birth to Isaac, God had restored her youth when she was 90. And her youthful looks, that glow, the maternity.
I know we had talked about that, but I was just thinking, why would he have to do that? And not just restore her strength itself in order for her to have a child and nurse it and stuff.
Why does God make the sun rise from the east instead of the west?
I know there's 1,000 different things that we could probably say about this.
Yeah.
And I just go for the simple. I've always have. That he would have just given her the strength to do that. Mm-hmm. I said this jokingly, of course. Maybe she held her age very well, like I do.
Yeah. Yeah.
But I mean, Because some women, even nowadays, uh, you know, they're a beautiful woman even in their 70s
Yeah.
and 80s. You know, it's like they don't look that old. We know they are because we know who they are. And but back then people weren't famous, so
Yeah.
he may have seen her. Maybe he was 80 years old,
Might have been.
and he's seen her and she looks 60. He's like, she's 20 years robbing the cradles, you know, as you say. As you
Yeah.
would say.
I mean, it could be. When you asked that question, the first thing that popped into my head that I was holding off on was that maybe it's just that God is more generous than we can wrap our heads around.
Mm-hmm.
Like for us, you know, good enough for government work. You know, that's our attitude in many cases. Like, or like one of my sergeants used to say, it's good enough for any girl I've ever dated. But God does more than enough.
Mm-hmm.
It seems to be a recurring theme, not only in the Bible but also in our lives. I know in my life, God does. He just goes the extra mile. Oh, what was that? Jesus said, if a centurion, if a Roman,
Ask you to go 1 mile, go with them too.
yeah, because
Mm-hmm.
you know, that was the law back then. They could press you for a mile, and Jesus says, go the extra mile. And he can say that because he has done that throughout history. That could be it. Another idea, you know, could be that, like we were talking earlier, Abraham was one of the richest men in the region, and he had a private army. So it could be that, you know, the way we see in movies, medieval, historical, whatever shows, a king would form an alliance and lord someone,
Mm-hmm.
and you know, oftentimes they would cement the alliance with marriage. So it could be that he was just saying, okay, she's old, but you know, I could really use this help.
Mm-hmm.
You know, because he's right next door to not only other Philistine kingdoms and other kingdoms further east that from time to time come to raid and maybe invade and take over. But the area's real superpower is just southwest of where he is. Egypt is right there.
Mm-hmm.
So maybe he thinks, if Egypt ever comes knocking on my door, I might need some more help. That could be it.
And it means that, like you said, he had his own private army, and they must have been some bad dudes. They must have been like Navy SEALs, you know, just to have a few hundred compared to others that, you know, probably had thousands. These guys must have been
Yeah, because one of
better
the
than most.
one of the kingdoms that he had to fight was Shinar, which later on became Babylon. Back then, it wasn't that big of a city. We're told historically that it was a backwater cow town, just a few generations ago. But still, it had been there for several generations now. It was growing. It later on becomes a very important empire, and even this early on, they have enough men to raid and invade hundreds of miles away. So, like you said, they must have been Special Forces caliber.